Have you ever felt the irresistible pull to enter a place you weren't supposed to? That curiosity that whispers, just one step further, it's harmless, right? Tonight, you're about to witness what happens when curiosity turns into terror. These aren't stories made up to scare you for fun. They are true accounts, collected from people who trespassed where they shouldn't have, only to discover that some doors are locked for a reason. From abandoned houses, frozen in time, to shadowed forests where something unseen watches your every move, to cemeteries hiding secrets that should never be disturbed. Each story you are about to hear is a glimpse into a world where boundaries exist for a reason, and crossing them can unleash horrors that linger long after the sun rises. You will meet individuals who ventured too far, ignored the warnings, and lived to tell a tale so chilling it will haunt your dreams. As you listen, remember these stories are real, and the fear is theirs, not ours. If you dare to continue, hit that subscribe button, join the Farcical Fears community, and brace yourself. Because once you start this journey, there's no turning back. Stay close, keep your lights on, and prepare yourself for 12 disturbing, true trespassing horror stories that will make you question whether curiosity is worth the price. Let's move to our first story. It was a gray, overcast afternoon when Daniel decided to take a shortcut through the forest behind the old mill. A place that everyone in town whispered about, but few dared to enter. He had heard stories, of course. The mill had been abandoned for decades, its machinery rusting and windows boarded. But there was always a thrill in the unknown, and Daniel's curiosity outweighed his sense of caution. The path leading into the trees was narrow, covered in wet leaves that slipped beneath his boots, and every step seemed to echo unnaturally in the stillness. Birds had stopped calling, and a cold wind moved through the branches, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and decay. As he walked deeper into the forest, the sound of his own breathing became the loudest noise around him. He passed fallen trees and moss-covered rocks, each shadow stretching in the odd, unnatural angles created by the fading light. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a flash of white among the shadows, but when he stopped and looked, nothing was there. He shrugged it off, telling himself it was just a trick of the light. But a gnawing feeling in his stomach refused to disappear. It was that same feeling people had described before disappearing. A sense of being watched, followed, and judged by something unseen. When Daniel finally reached the mill, it was even more imposing than he remembered. The massive structure loomed over him, its walls scarred by years of neglect, windows either broken or sealed shut with warped boards. A faint smell of rust and mold escaped from a broken vent near the entrance, and he hesitated on the threshold. He could turn back, leave it for another day, but the pull of curiosity was irresistible. Carefully, he pushed open the creaking door, the sound echoing like a scream into the hollow interior. Inside, everything was coated in dust and silence. Rusted machinery jutted from the floor like the skeleton of some long-dead creature, and the air was heavy with a damp, metallic scent. At first, Daniel moved slowly, methodically, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. He was careful not to disturb anything, though each step made the floorboards groan, as if complaining at his intrusion. It wasn't long before he began noticing the signs that something wasn't right. Footprints wet and muddy appeared on the floor, but they weren't his own. They were smaller, almost childlike, and they moved erratically, weaving in and out of the shadows as if leading him somewhere deeper inside. He stopped and shined his light down the hall, heart pounding, but the hall appeared empty. Then he heard it, a soft tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere above him. Daniel froze. The tapping grew louder, moving from one end of the hall to the other, like footsteps pacing on a floor that should have been decayed and weak. His mind raced. Perhaps it was an animal, a raccoon, or a stray cat, but the pattern was too deliberate, too intentional. It wasn't something that belonged in the natural world. The air grew colder, and he could see his breath fogging before him. Panic was creeping into his chest, but he told himself he could handle this, that he was safe, as long as he didn't wander too far. Then came the whispering, barely audible. It sounded almost like words, soft and drawn out. Go, leave. Go. It wasn't in any language Daniel recognized, yet it carried an unmistakable urgency. His flashlight flickered, and for a split second, he thought he saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, tall, pale, impossibly still, with dark hollows where eyes should have been. The figure vanished before he could focus on it, leaving him alone again, yet the sense of being watched intensified. Daniel tried to retrace his steps, moving back toward the entrance, but the layout of the mill seemed to shift. Corridors that had been straight now twisted at odd angles, and doors he had seen clearly before were suddenly gone. Every turn led him deeper into a labyrinth of shadows and rusted metal. He called out, hoping for a voice or a sound of someone else nearby, but only his own echo responded, mocking him in the emptiness. Hours seemed to pass, or perhaps only minutes, but time had lost meaning. The whispers returned, more insistent now, mixed with footsteps that matched his pace, yet never appeared in the beam of his flashlight. Sweat poured down his face, and he felt his knees weakening. The once faint smell of decay now turned acrid, almost choking him, and then he saw them. Small handprints smeared in dust on the wall, moving from floor to ceiling, ascending unnaturally, as if invisible hands were climbing the walls above him. Daniel ran. His heart was pounding like a drum, and every instinct screamed that he had to escape. He didn't know where he was going, only that the whispers and the tapping followed him relentlessly. The exit seemed impossibly far away, though he had entered moments before. And then the figure appeared again, closer this time, its hollow eyes staring directly at him. He couldn't see a mouth, but the whispering was louder now, forming words he could understand. "You shouldn't have come here." Finally, he burst through the door and into the cold, misty forest. He didn't stop running until the mill was a shadow in the distance, hidden among the twisted branches. Gasping for air, he looked back, but the building seemed dormant, empty, as if nothing had been alive inside at all. And yet, when he returned home, Daniel discovered something chilling. Muddy footprints on his floor that weren't his own, leading from the door to the center of his living room, and on the wall, a single handprint smeared in dust. Impossibly tall, impossibly human, and yet impossibly not. Daniel never spoke of the mill again. But the nightmares followed him, shadows moving in corners, whispering in languages he couldn't understand, always reminding him that some boundaries should never be crossed. And the footprints, they never disappeared, no matter how often he cleaned. They were a permanent reminder that the forest and the mill had claimed a piece of him, and that trespassing curiosity can have consequences that last far longer than any single terrifying night. Even after returning home, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the mill had followed him. The whispers lingered in his ears at night, faint but insistent, always just at the edge of his hearing, curling around his thoughts when he tried to sleep. Shadows seemed to shift unnaturally in the corners of his apartment, elongating or retreating. Whenever he blinked or looked away, the footprints were worse. No matter how often he scrubbed the floor, wiped the walls, or rearranged furniture. Muddy smudges appeared again in the morning, stretching from the doorway to the center of the room, leading to nowhere and everywhere at once. Each time he cleaned, he felt a cold pressure in the air, as though invisible eyes were watching, measuring, marking him. During the day, he tried to act normal, but paranoia had routed itself deep inside. At work, every creak of the ceiling, every shadow cast by passing coworkers, felt like the mill reaching for him. The faint whispering sometimes returned, even in broad daylights, soft, insistent, unintelligible, but unmistakably there. Daniel began recording his own apartment, setting up cameras in every room, desperate for proof or explanation. When he reviewed the footage, nothing seemed out of place until he noticed the shadows. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible, they moved against the flow of light, stretching unnaturally, thickening in corners, forming shapes that shouldn't exist. And sometimes, in the reflection of his own eyes on the screen, he saw glimpses of something else, a tall, pale figure standing just behind him, fading whenever he turned. He stopped leaving the apartment, except for essentials. Every time he stepped outside, the forest seemed to call him back, an irresistible pull he couldn't resist. The fear of returning to the mill was outweighed by an obsession he didn't understand. He needed answers, closure, or perhaps to confront whatever force had attached itself to him. Even talking to friends became impossible. The words felt hollow, meaningless, as though anything spoken could invite the mill's presence further into his life. He avoided mirrors, because sometimes he thought the reflections were wrong, the shadows in the glass too deep, stretching beyond the contours of the room. Sleep became a battleground. In his dreams, the mill was alive, corridors twisting endlessly, walls breathing, and whispers forming words he couldn't always recognize. Sometimes the attic door appeared in places it shouldn't exist, in his apartment, in the streets, even in the ceiling of his office. He woke drenched in sweat, heart hammering, only to find footprints on the floor, or faint scratches on the walls that hadn't been there before. It was no longer just a memory of trespassing. It was a continuous, living nightmare. The more he tried to escape, the more the mill's presence expanded into his reality. Feeding off fear, curiosity, and obsession, Daniel realized, slowly and with growing horror, that he had become a permanent part of the mill's story. Leaving had never freed him. The whispers, the shadows, the footprints, they were warnings and reminders that trespassing wasn't something to survive. It was something to endure. And while the outside world remained oblivious, his life had become a prison, a constant loop of dread that no one else could see or understand. The mill had claimed more than a night or a moment of curiosity, had claimed him, leaving an imprint that would last as long as he lived. Let's move to our second story. It began on a quiet autumn evening when Lisa and her friends decided to explore the old abandoned quarry on the outskirts of their town. The place had been closed for decades, a dangerous relic of a time when the mining company had thrived, then vanished without explanation. Locals avoided it, whispering tales of accidents, disappearances, and strange lights at night. But for Lisa, it was the perfect thriller combination of curiosity and the reckless confidence of youth. The sky was a fading orange as they approached the rusted gates, and a chill hung in the air that had nothing to do with the season. The quarry itself was vast, a hollowed-out scar in the earth, with jagged cliffs rising on all sides. Weeds and overgrown bushes had claimed the paths, and broken machinery lay scattered like skeletons of a long-dead industry. The friends laughed nervously, trying to mask the unease that had begun to creep into their hearts. Every so often, a distant caw of a crow echoed from somewhere above, startling them into silence. The sun slipped below the horizon, and shadows stretched unnaturally across the quarry floor, twisting and shifting as though alive. Lisa felt the first prickling of fear when she noticed something odd near the far cliff face. A series of footprints led to a darkened crevice, mud-streaked and deep, as if someone or something had walked there recently. She called to her friends, but they dismissed it as an animal trail, though even they exchanged uneasy glances. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying faint whispers that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. Lisa froze. It was impossible to tell if the sound was real or imagined, yet it had a rhythm, a deliberate cadence, as if someone or something was trying to communicate. As darkness fell, the quarry transformed. The cliffs became looming black walls, the shadows deeper and more oppressive. Every small noise rocks tumbling, wind rustling through the weeds echoed unnaturally, as if amplified by some hidden acoustics of the pit. Lisa's friends began to feel the creeping dread, their laughter replaced by silence. Then came the first sighting, a faint glow emanating from the top of the cliff, like a lantern swaying, though there was no one there. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, and when Lisa squinted, she thought she saw a figure at the edge, pale and tall, watching them. Nervous energy gave way to tension as the glow disappeared, replaced by something worse. Faint scratching noises, coming from the crevice where the footprints had led. The sound was soft at first, almost imperceptible, then grew louder, echoing in the quarry like fingernails scraping stone. Lisa wanted to run, but her feet felt rooted, as though invisible. Hands held her in place. Her friends whispered hurried suggestions to leave. But curiosity, the same force that had brought them here, kept them moving closer to the crevice. Peering into the darkness, Lisa felt a chill that was almost physical. The crevice seemed bottomless, a narrow gap that descended into pitch-black nothingness. From somewhere deep inside came a low guttural growl, resonating off the stone walls. The group froze, straining to see, to hear more, but the darkness swallowed everything beyond the first few feet. And then, a scream erupted, not human, not entirely but high-pitched and shrill. ricocheting through the quarry and making the ground tremble. The friends stumbled back, heart pounding, but Lisa's gaze remained fixed on the black abyss. Something was down there. Something alive. Something waiting. The night stretched on, and the fear became unbearable. The shadows seemed to move independently, shapes darting at the edge of vision. Every sound was magnified. Dripping water, the rustle of leaves, the echo of distant rocks tumbling. And then came the whispers again, soft and indistinct at first, growing into phrases she could just make out. "You shouldn't be here. Leave, leave." They sounded both urgent and mocking, and they seemed to come from all directions. Panic surged through Lisa, and yet a part of her, the part that had led her here, compelled her to continue, to see, to understand. Hours or, perhaps minutes, time lost all meaning, passed in a blur of fear. The pale figure reappeared briefly, at the top of the cliff, just as the friends had decided to leave. It didn't move like a human, its posture unnatural, elongated, its presence almost entirely silent. Lisa swore she saw it smile, or at least the suggestion of a smile before it vanished again into the night. That was when the scratching noises began to follow them, moving along the ground, circling them in ways that defied logic. The quarry no longer felt like a place. It felt like a trap, a living entity feeding on their terror. By the time Lisa and her friends reached the gate and stumbled out into the cold night air, the sense of relief was temporary. The quarry, distant and silent, seemed to watch them as they fled. And Lisa knew something had attached itself to her, a lingering presence that wouldn't leave. The footprints, the whispers, the glowing figure, they were not bound by distance or daylight. That night marked the beginning of a new fear, one that invaded dreams, that made shadows twitch unnaturally in her apartment, that made every quiet moment unbearable. The quarry had claimed a piece of her, and she understood, with chilling clarity, that curiosity and trespassing carried consequences far beyond a single terrifying evening, even after they had escaped the quarry. Lisa could not rid herself of the feeling that something had followed them home. That night, in her own room, the shadows seemed different, thicker, moving independently of the moonlight that filtered through the curtains. Every small noise, the creak of the radiator, the whisper of wind through the trees outside, made her heart leap into her throat. Sleep was impossible. She lay awake for hours, convinced that every corner held a dark presence, waiting, patient, and relentless. In her dreams, the quarry returned, larger and more labyrinthine than reality, with the pale figure standing silently at impossible angles, watching, always watching. The days that followed were worse. Lisa began noticing small, inexplicable things. Objects in her apartment slightly moved, doors that she was certain she had closed standing ajar, and fleeting glimpses of movement in mirrors that disappeared when she looked directly. The whispers from the quarry returned sporadically, faint, at first almost like the memory of the sound, then growing louder and more distinct. "You didn't leave. You're ours. You shouldn't have come." She began recording audio and video, desperate for proof, but each time she reviewed the footage, nothing appeared, no shadows, no figures, no footprints, yet she felt the same oppressive presence she had felt in the quarry. Her friends were no better. Each of them reported dreams of the quarry, nightmares so vivid they would wake screaming, clutching at the shadows around their beds. Some claimed to hear the whispers in their own rooms, faint but unmistakable, following them through the day. Lisa realized they had all been marked, their curiosity tethering them to something beyond comprehension, something ancient and patient, waiting for intruders to trespass so it could consume part of them. Piece by piece, the paranoia became suffocating. Lisa could no longer walk outside without feeling the weight of unseen eyes on her back. Even in public, she felt pursued, followed by intangible figures moving just out of sight. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself the fear was psychological, the result of adrenaline and trauma, but deep down she knew it was different. The quarry had reached into her life in a way no rational explanation could cover. Footsteps echoed when no one was there, shadows lingered longer than they should, and whispers grew more coherent over time, forming words that chilled her blood. Return, stay, never leave. One evening, drawn by a mixture of fear and compulsion she could not resist, Lisa found herself back at the edge of the quarry. The gate, long rusted, creaked ominously in the wind, as if welcoming her. Her heart pounded in her chest, yet she stepped forward, compelled by a need she could not explain. The cliffs loomed above her, dark and jagged, the shadows deepening with every step. The fog hung thick, curling around her ankles, rising in tendrils that seemed alive, moving against the breeze. And then she saw it, the faint glow at the top of the cliff, swaying slowly, deliberately, like a lantern carried by a pale, impossible figure. This time, it did not vanish. Lisa's pulse quickened as she realized it was waiting for her. She could see the elongated form, more clear, limbs unnaturally thin, its face a pale mask with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. A low, guttural growl emanated from the shadows, reverberating off the stone walls. And the whispering began anew, louder and more insistent. "You belong here. Leave us. Stay with us. Forever." Every instinct screamed to run, yet her legs remained rooted to the ground. Trapped by an invisible force she could not resist. Hours or what felt like hours passed in that state of paralysis. Shadows twisted around her, forming shapes that resembled her friends, her own reflection, figures from her nightmares. The pale figure descended slowly, toward the foggy ground, its presence consuming the light, bending the world around her. Lisa realized, in a moment of stark terror, that the quarry was not simply haunted, it was alive, a predator feeding on trespassers, latching on to curiosity and fear. Escape was no longer an option. The quarry had claimed a part of her soul, and the glow, the whispers, the shadows, they would not let her go. Let's move to our third story. It was a late spring evening when Michael and his cousin Tyler decided to explore the abandoned industrial complex at the edge of their town. Locals called it the Hollow Works, a sprawling factory that had once churned out machinery parts, but had been shut down abruptly after a series of unexplained accidents. Stories of workers disappearing, strange machinery malfunctions, and ghostly figures wandering the halls had circulated for decades. But curiosity and teenage bravado pushed Michael and Tyler past the rusted gates. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of red and violet as they stepped over broken chains and debris. The air was thick with the scent of decay, metal, and something fouler they couldn't identify. The complex was massive, a labyrinth of brick buildings, collapsed roofs, and shattered glass. Rusted conveyors and discarded equipment littered the floors, and weeds had begun reclaiming the concrete. Shadows stretched unnaturally in the fading light, and the wind whistled through broken windows and empty doorframes like a chorus of warning cries. Michael's stomach churned as they ventured further, each step echoing ominously through the cavernous spaces. There was a heavy silence, punctuated only by the occasional thud of a falling piece of metal or the rustle of unseen creatures moving. In the shadows, at first they explored cautiously, joking to mask the unease that had begun to settle in their chests. But as darkness crept over the complex, the laughter died quickly, replaced by tense silence. Then Michael saw it, a faint movement at the edge of a shattered doorway, just at the corner of his vision. He spun toward it, but there was nothing, only broken bricks, twisted metal, and shadows that seemed deeper than they should have been. Tyler, sensing the change in Michael's demeanor, urged him to move on, but curiosity gnawed at both of them. They had heard the stories, of course, but there was a part of Michael that wanted to see for himself what lurked in the Hollow Works. As they moved deeper into the complex, the atmosphere became oppressive. The air seemed to thicken, carrying a metallic tang and a faint whispering, like distant voices carried on the wind. Michael paused, straining to hear, and realized the whispers were more than just the wind, they were words. Indistinct but deliberate, forming phrases he couldn't entirely make out. Tyler shook his head, insisting he was imagining things, yet his own face betrayed a growing fear. Shadows flickered in every corner, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the empty halls. Rhythmic and unnatural, as if keeping some dark beat. Hours or what felt like hours passed as they navigated the labyrinth of the factory. The floors groaned underfoot, ceilings dripped with rust-colored liquid, and every doorway seemed to lead to another identical corridor, stretching endlessly, trapping them in a confusing maze. The whispers grew louder, more coherent, forming phrases that made their blood run cold. You shouldn't be here. Leave, or stay forever. The voices seemed to surround them, coming from all directions at once. Panic rose, but each time they tried to retrace their steps, the corridors twisted, the exits vanishing, replaced by more shadowed passageways and debris-strewn floors. It was then that the first figure appeared. A pale, gaunt man, what appeared to be a man, emerged from the shadows. Moving unnaturally, its limbs elongated and joints bending at impossible angles. Its eyes glowed faintly, not red, not white, but an otherworldly pale blue that pierced the darkness. Michael froze, his heart hammering, while Tyler instinctively tried to run, but found his feet glued to the ground. The figure made no sound, yet its presence radiated menace. It tilted its head, observing them with an intelligence that was horrifyingly deliberate. Michael realized, with dawning terror, that the stories were true. Whatever haunted the Hollowworks was not merely a memory, but an active, intelligent presence, capable of hunting and tormenting intruders. The chase began almost silently. The figure didn't run. It glided, unnervingly fluid, following them through corridors and collapsed rooms. Every turn they took seemed to lead them back to the same central hall, a vast chamber with broken machinery and scattered tools. Shadows shifted independently of the boys' movements, shapes forming and dissolving, whispering in voices that were simultaneously familiar and alien. Michael could feel it. The factory itself had become alive, an extension of the entity that now stalked them. Their fear was not just emotional, it was physical, pressing on their bodies, making breathing difficult, muscles tense, and senses hyper-aware of every tiny sound in a desperate bid. Michael remembered an old map of the complex he had seen online, detailing the original layout of the factory. They tried to follow it, hoping to find an exit through the maintenance tunnels, but the corridors no longer aligned with reality. Walls seemed to stretch, ceilings lowered, and floors shifted, as if the building itself were reshaping to trap them further. The whispers had evolved into words Michael could understand clearly now. "You cannot leave. You belong to us," Tyler screamed, a sound cut short as a cold, invisible force slammed him into the wall, leaving him trembling and gasping for air. Michael grabbed his arm, pulling him onward, the presence of the figure close enough that he could feel the icy air emanating from it. Hours turned into an endless nightmare. The factory had no natural rhythm of time. The boys had no way of knowing how long they had been trapped. Hunger and thirst faded into irrelevance as terror dominated every thought. The pale figure continued its silent pursuit, vanishing momentarily, only to reappear in another corridor or across a pile of broken machinery. The shadows themselves became active, crawling across floors and walls, forming grotesque, human-like shapes that reached for them with impossible limbs. Michael realized that the entity feeding on trespassers did not just torment physically, it altered reality, reshaping the environment to heighten fear and helplessness, exhausted and desperate. Michael remembered an old rumor. The factory had once been shut down after an industrial accident, and the bodies of several workers had never been recovered. Locals whispered that the factory was cursed, the spirits of the dead bound to the building, their rage and suffering coalescing into a malevolent presence. Michael began to understand that the pale figure and the moving shadows were not just ghosts, they were the physical manifestation of every fear, every death, every trespasser that had wandered into the Hollowworks. The building itself had become a predator, and they were its prey. They stumbled into a massive central chamber, the heart of the factory, filled with rusting equipment and shattered glass. The figure appeared at the far end, motionless, yet impossibly close. The shadows around it writhed like living things, forming faces that screamed silently, reaching toward the boys. Michael's mind raced for a solution, for any plan to escape. But the whispers now consumed all rational thought. You cannot leave. You belong, forever. He grabbed Tyler, running toward a side corridor. But the passage elongated impossibly, walls stretching like elastic, and the exit seemed further than ever. A sudden, deafening clang echoed through the chamber, and the pale figure moved faster, almost gliding toward them, its blue eyes fixed and merciless. The boys' legs burned, lungs screaming for air, as shadows clawed at them from all sides. Michael stumbled, falling to his knees, but a surge of instinct propelled him forward. He realized that fear was their leash. The more terrified they became, the more powerful the entity grew. Focusing on calm, on thought, gave him a slight edge, allowing them to navigate the warped corridors with a sliver of control. Finally, after what felt like eternity, they reached the original entrance gate, the rusted metal looming ahead. Michael pushed with all his strength, the gate yielding just enough to slip through. The instant they emerged into the cool night air, the oppressive weight lifted, and the factory behind them fell silent once more. The whispers ceased, replaced by an unnatural stillness, as though the building were holding its breath, waiting for the next intruders. They ran until the lights of the town appeared in the distance, gasping, trembling, forever changed. But the hollow works had left its mark. That night, Michael awoke to shadows crawling along his walls, whispers curling through his apartment, and the faint, impossible sound of machinery grinding in the distance. Tyler's reflection in the mirror seemed to twitch independently, and both knew that the factory's presence had followed them, a permanent shadow haunting their lives. The Hollowworks had claimed not only their terror, but a part of their very being, a reminder that curiosity and trespassing carried consequences far beyond imagination. Consequences that no daylight or distance could undo. Let's move to our fourth story. It started on a bitterly cold winter evening, when Samantha and her two friends, Jordan and Avery, decided to explore the long-abandoned Ashford Manor, a decaying estate on the outskirts of their town. The house had been empty for decades, a shadowed relic of a once wealthy family that had vanished mysteriously. Rumors spoke of strange lights in the windows at night, whispers of ghostly footsteps in the halls, and the occasional sighting of figures moving silently in the upper floors. Curiosity, combined with teenage bravado and a sense of invincibility, pushed them past the rotting fence and toward the front entrance, their breath visible in the frigid night air. The manor was colossal, its walls pockmarked with peeling paint, windows broken or boarded haphazardly, and icicles hanging like jagged teeth from the eaves. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood, decay, and something sweeter, almost like rotting fruit, though they could not identify its source. The floors groaned under their weight, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the grand staircase and hallways. Samantha shivered, not only from the cold, but from a creeping sense of unease she could not name. Every step they took echoed through the empty halls, magnifying even the smallest sound into a thunderous crack that set their nerves on edge. At first, the exploration felt exciting, even thrilling. They joked to mask the fear, moving cautiously from room to room, each more dilapidated than the last. But as the sun sank lower behind the horizon, the manor seemed to transform. The shadows deepened, stretching into impossible shapes that seemed to move independently. The fireplace in the main hall, though filled with ashes, seemed to emit a faint warmth, as if something within it was alive. Samantha caught glimpses of figures in the corners of her eyes, figures that vanished the instant she turned to face them. She tried to convince herself it was her imagination, the play of shadows and weak moonlight filtering through broken windows. The first undeniable event occurred when Avery called out to Samantha and Jordan. She claimed she had seen a small child, pale and gaunt, standing silently at the end of the long corridor on the second floor. When the others rushed to look, the hallway was empty. But cold air swirled around them unnaturally, and they all felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Samantha's heart pounded, and she began to sense a presence in the house that was aware of their every movement. The whispers began shortly after, not loud at first, barely perceptible, like a draft moving through cracks in the walls, but gradually they became coherent, forming words that chilled them to the bone. "Leave. You don't belong here. This is ours." Despite their fear, curiosity compelled them further. The house seemed to shift as they moved, corridors elongating, rooms appearing in places they were certain had been empty moments before. Mirrors reflected glimpses of figures that weren't there, and doors they had previously passed now led to staircases they didn't remember. Samantha realized with dawning terror that the manor was not simply abandoned, it was alive, a twisting, malevolent entity reshaping reality to ensnare intruders. Every step forward deepened their sense of helplessness, and panic threatened to overtake reason as the whispers grew louder. Now joined by faint footsteps echoing their own, but always slightly behind, as if something or someone was following them unseen, yet aware. In the main ballroom, the trio discovered a series of old photographs lining the walls, yellowed with age but disturbingly vivid. Faces stared back at them, many of children, eyes dark and hollow, expressions frozen in terror. One photograph in particular caught Samantha's attention, a young girl, her face pale and gaunt, eyes impossibly dark, standing in the very same hallway Avery had described. The girl's eyes seemed to follow Samantha, and a shiver ran through her body as a whisper breathed her name. The realization hit her: they were not just trespassing in a house. They were intruding into a space filled with lingering, tormented souls. A place where the dead and the malevolent intertwined. Time lost meaning as they explored further. Rooms twisted and shifted. Corridors seemed to loop endlessly, and every step brought new horrors. Furniture moved subtly when unobserved. Shadows crept along walls independently, and the temperature dropped drastically in some areas, frosting their breath in the air. Jordan swore he felt cold hands brush his shoulder and saw fleeting glimpses of figures crouched in corners, watching. Avery's voice trembled as she whispered about seeing doors that led to endless staircases descending into darkness, places where no light could reach. Samantha could feel the oppressive weight of the house pressing down on them, filling their minds with dread and visions of unspeakable acts. By midnight, the trio had reached the heart of the manor, a grand library lined with towering bookshelves. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by their movement. Samantha's eyes caught a glint of something metallic on one of the tables, a small, ornate music box, its surface engraved with symbols they didn't recognize. Hesitant but compelled, Samantha wound the key. The music that emerged was faint, a haunting melody that seemed to reach into their very minds. The room darkened immediately, shadows twisting violently, and the whispers escalated into screams. From the corners of the library, figures began to emerge, pale, distorted, moving unnaturally, surrounding the trio. The house was revealing itself fully, its presence no longer subtle but overwhelmingly hostile. Samantha felt an icy hand grip her shoulder. She spun, but no one was there yet. The sensation persisted, like a phantom tether. Jordan screamed as a shadow lunged at him, moving with impossible speed, then dissipated into mist. Avery was frozen, unable to move, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at something invisible but deadly. The house itself seemed to breathe, inhaling and exhaling, the very walls shifting to close in on them. Samantha realized that the manor did not merely want to scare them, wanted to claim them, to trap their essence within its endless halls, to join the tortured souls that had been ensnared over generations. Desperation took over. They ran, navigating corridors that had transformed into impossible labyrinths, staircases folding upon themselves, doors appearing in places they had just passed. The whispers became voices, mocking, cruel, taunting. "You cannot leave. You are ours, forever." Their panic intensified with every step, the very architecture conspiring against them. Samantha's mind struggled to retain rational thought as the house pressed upon their senses. Shadows crawling along floors, fleeting glimpses of pale figures, cold drafts that seemed alive. It became clear that this night, this trespass was unlike any other. They were facing a presence far beyond natural understanding, a malevolent intelligence thriving on fear and curiosity. After what felt like hours, the trio found themselves in a courtyard, moonlight barely penetrating the overgrown vegetation. Exhausted, terrified, and nearly frozen from the cold, they stumbled through the gate and into the forest beyond. Behind them, the manor remained silent, dormant, yet pulsating with a presence that lingered, watching. But the experience was not over that night, and in the nights that followed, Samantha and her friends were haunted. Shadows moved independently in their homes, whispers filled the quiet moments, and dreams of the manor's twisting halls and pale figures invaded their sleep. The Ashford Manor had claimed part of them, an invisible tether linking their lives to the cursed estate forever. Let's move to our fifth story. It was the height of summer when Lucas, a local urban explorer, decided to venture into the long-abandoned Crestwood Hospital, a sprawling asylum on the outskirts of town. The building had been shuttered for decades, after reports of malpractice, mysterious patient deaths, and unexplained disappearances. Locals whispered of screams echoing through the empty halls at night, of lights flickering in wards where no one should be, and of shadows moving independently of anyone's presence. The allure of discovering the truth, or at least something worthy of his exploration, drove Lucas past the rusted gates, his camera equipment clutched tightly in hand. The sun was just dipping below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked pavement and overgrown weeds that had claimed the front courtyard. From the moment he stepped inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The hospital smelled of mold, disinfectant, long decayed, and something far fouler, as though the building itself carried the stench of suffering. Hallways stretched on impossibly, with peeling wallpaper revealing glimpses of brick beneath, and cracked floor tiles creating an uneven path. Every sound he made echoed loudly, bouncing off the empty walls and ceilings, making it impossible to determine where it originated. He paused at the nurse's station, noticing scattered charts, yellowed with age, and water-damaged files strewn across the counter. A faint whisper brushed his ear, almost like the murmur of a long-forgotten patient, but when he spun around, no one was there. As Lucas moved deeper into the hospital, the corridors began to feel oppressive, as though the walls themselves were pressing in. The old fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting shadows that seemed to twitch unnaturally in the corners of his vision. Occasionally, he glimpsed fleeting figures, pale hunched, moving just beyond the reach of his flashlight. His camera equipment recorded every frame, yet reviewing it later, the footage revealed nothing out of the ordinary. That disconnect made his skin crawl. He realized that whatever haunted Crestwood Hospital was not bound by the physical world, able to skirt detection while inducing an acute sense of dread in one of the old patient wards. Lucas found evidence of the hospital's sinister past. Rusted bed frames lined the walls, some tipped over, others with restraints still attached, decaying and dust-covered. The air felt heavier here, each breath thick with tension. A journal lay atop one of the beds, pages yellowed and brittle, filled with hastily scrawled notes, detailing experimental treatments and cryptic warnings. Do not trust the shadows. They hear, they watch. The handwriting became increasingly erratic, toward the end, almost frantic. As he read, a soft moan echoed from the far end of the ward. Lucas's pulse quickened, the hairs on his arms standing on end. Slowly, deliberately, he moved toward the sound, camera ready, yet the moan dissolved into silence, leaving only the oppressive stillness of the abandoned ward. The deeper he explored, the hospital began to warp in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Doors he had passed moments before now led to rooms he didn't recognize. Staircases seemed longer than they should have been, their steps echoing unnaturally. The whispers grew louder, forming fragmented words. Leave, leave, or join. Each utterance seemed to press on his mind, creating an anxiety that was more physical than psychological, like a weight settling in his chest. He realized with growing horror that the hospital was alive in some sense, feeding on intruders' fear, warping reality to disorient and trap them in the psychiatric wing. The most harrowing part of the hospital, Lucas found cells with metal bars rusted through decades of neglect. The walls were scrawled with messages, some desperate, some threatening, others impossible to decipher. He felt the undeniable sensation of being watched, and for the first time, the air seemed to thrum with an unseen presence. A shadow darted across the floor, impossibly fast, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. His own reflection in a cracked window pane didn't mimic his movements, exactly. His eyes seemed to flicker unnaturally. And for a brief moment, he swore his mouth smiled when he wasn't smiling. Panic surged, but curiosity anchored him. He needed to see more, to understand the horrors lurking in Crestwood Hospital. Hours passed, or what felt like hours, though the hospital's unnatural influence made time meaningless. He reached the surgical wing, where decaying equipment and overturned tables painted a grim history. Rusted scalpels and jars of preserved tissue hinted at experiments far beyond standard medical practice. A faint light glowed at the far end of the hall, and Lucas approached cautiously. Shadows danced along the walls, elongating and twisting as though the light itself could not penetrate the malignancy of the place. Suddenly, the light flickered and vanished, replaced by a figure so pale and emaciated it seemed almost spectral, with eyes black voids and limbs moving in unnatural angles. The figure didn't speak, but radiated malevolence. Forcing Lucas to stumble backward, he turned to flee, only to find the hallway elongated, impossible distances stretching beyond comprehension. The whispers intensified, now forming a chorus of voices from every corner, chanting, laughing, screaming, simultaneously. Lucas's fear reached its peak. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows lunged toward him, and the temperature plummeted, sharply, frosting his breath. He realized the hospital didn't merely want to scare intruders, it wanted to trap them, to merge their essence into its walls, adding to the legion of tortured souls that had come before. Every escape route seemed to collapse, corridors looping endlessly back to the surgical wing, as if the building itself were conscious and malicious. In a moment of desperate clarity, Lucas remembered the stories of past explorers and patients, who had vanished, leaving only equipment, journals, and echoes. The hospital's sentience thrived on trespassers' fear, warping their perception until reality itself became unreliable. With trembling hands, he attempted to record everything, hoping documentation could serve as proof, or at least a lifeline. Shadows flickered around him, some forming grotesque humanoid shapes, others blending seamlessly with the darkness. The whispers now directly addressed him. "You cannot leave. You belong." His escape became a frenzied navigation through corridors that bent, staircases that twisted impossibly, and rooms that appeared and disappeared at will. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of other figures, lost explorers, or perhaps manifestations of the hospital itself, staring from corners with blank, accusatory eyes. Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, yet adrenaline pushed him forward. Every step was a struggle, each breath filled with icy dread, and the weight of unseen eyes pressed constantly on his mind. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Lucas stumbled through a side exit into the overgrown courtyard. The night air hit his face, and the oppressive weight of the hospital lifted slightly, though not entirely. The building remained ominously silent, yet he felt it watching, waiting, calculating for the next intruder. Trembling, he ran across the weeds and cracked pavement. Camera clutched to his chest, ears straining for the faintest sound. Behind him, the windows of Crestwood Hospital reflected the moonlight, unblinking, unyielding, like eyes that had seen countless trespassers and would see countless more. The experience did not end once he left. That night, and in the weeks following, Lucas experienced nightmares of the hospital. Shadows stretching across his bedroom, whispers echoing in empty rooms, and fleeting glimpses of pale, emaciated figures. The hospital had marked him, leaving an invisible tether between himself and the building. Every creak in his apartment sounded like the floorboards of the asylum. Every flicker of light felt like the glow of the surgical wing. Crestwood Hospital had claimed more than his fear. It had taken a piece of his reality. A permanent reminder that curiosity in places marked by suffering can carry consequences far beyond imagination. Let's move to our fifth story. It was the height of summer when Lucas, a local urban explorer, decided to venture into the long-abandoned Crestwood Hospital, a sprawling asylum on the outskirts of town. The building had been shuttered for decades, after reports of malpractice, mysterious patient deaths, and unexplained disappearances. Locals whispered of screams echoing through the empty halls at night, of lights flickering in wards where no one should be, and of shadows moving independently of anyone's presence. The allure of discovering the truth, or at least something worthy of his exploration, drove Lucas past the rusted gates, his camera equipment clutched tightly in hand. The sun was just dipping below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked pavement and overgrown weeds that had claimed the front courtyard. From the moment he stepped inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The hospital smelled of mold, disinfectant, long decayed, and something far fouler, as though the building itself carried the stench of suffering. Hallways stretched on impossibly, with peeling wallpaper revealing glimpses of brick beneath, and cracked floor tiles creating an uneven path. Every sound he made echoed loudly, bouncing off the empty walls and ceilings, making it impossible to determine where it originated. He paused at the nurse's station, noticing scattered charts, yellowed with age, and water-damaged files strewn. Across the counter, a faint whisper brushed his ear, almost like the murmur of a long-forgotten patient, but when he spun around, no one was there. As Lucas moved deeper into the hospital, the corridors began to feel oppressive, as though the walls themselves were pressing in. The old fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting shadows that seemed to twitch unnaturally in the corners of his vision. Occasionally, he glimpsed fleeting figures, pale hunched, moving just beyond the reach of his flashlight. His camera equipment recorded every frame, yet reviewing it later, the footage revealed nothing out of the ordinary. That disconnect made his skin crawl. He realized that whatever haunted Crestwood Hospital was not bound by the physical world, able to skirt detection while inducing an acute sense of dread in one of the old patient wards. Lucas found evidence of the hospital's sinister past. Rusted bed frames lined the walls, some tipped over, others with restraints still attached, decaying and dust-covered. The air felt heavier here, each breath thick with tension. A journal lay atop one of the beds, pages yellowed and brittle, filled with hastily scrawled notes, detailing experimental treatments and cryptic warnings. Do not trust the shadows. They hear, they watch. The handwriting became increasingly erratic, toward the end, almost frantic. As he read, a soft moan echoed from the far end of the ward. Lucas's pulse quickened, the hairs on his arms standing on end. Slowly, deliberately, he moved toward the sound, camera ready, yet the moan dissolved into silence, leaving only the oppressive stillness of the abandoned ward. The deeper he explored, the hospital began to warp in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Doors he had passed moments before now led to rooms he didn't recognize. Staircases seemed longer than they should have been, their steps echoing unnaturally. The whispers grew louder, forming fragmented words. Leave, leave, or join. Each utterance seemed to press on his mind, creating an anxiety that was more physical than psychological, like a weight settling in his chest. He realized with growing horror that the hospital was alive in some sense, feeding on intruders' fear, warping reality to disorient and trap them in the psychiatric wing. The most harrowing part of the hospital, Lucas found cells with metal bars rusted through decades of neglect. The walls were scrawled with messages, some desperate, some threatening, others impossible to decipher. He felt the undeniable sensation of being watched, and for the first time, the air seemed to thrum with an unseen presence. A shadow darted across the floor, impossibly fast, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. His own reflection in a cracked window pane didn't mimic his movements, exactly. His eyes seemed to flicker unnaturally. And for a brief moment, he swore his mouth smiled when he wasn't smiling. Panic surged, but curiosity anchored him. He needed to see more, to understand the horrors lurking in Crestwood Hospital. Hours passed, or what felt like hours, though the hospital's unnatural influence made time meaningless. He reached the surgical wing, where decaying equipment and overturned tables painted a grim history. Rusted scalpels and jars of preserved tissue hinted at experiments far beyond standard medical practice. A faint light glowed at the far end of the hall, and Lucas approached cautiously. Shadows danced along the walls, elongating and twisting as though the light itself could not penetrate the malignancy of the place. Suddenly, the light flickered and vanished, replaced by a figure so pale and emaciated it seemed almost spectral, with eyes black voids and limbs moving in unnatural angles. The figure didn't speak, but radiated malevolence. Forcing Lucas to stumble backward, he turned to flee, only to find the hallway elongated, impossible distances stretching beyond comprehension. The whispers intensified, now forming a chorus of voices from every corner, chanting, laughing, screaming, simultaneously. Lucas's fear reached its peak. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows lunged toward him, and the temperature plummeted, sharply, frosting his breath. He realized the hospital didn't merely want to scare intruders, it wanted to trap them, to merge their essence into its walls, adding to the legion of tortured souls that had come before. Every escape route seemed to collapse, corridors looping endlessly back to the surgical wing, as if the building itself were conscious and malicious. In a moment of desperate clarity, Lucas remembered the stories of past explorers and patients who had vanished, leaving only equipment, journals, and echoes. The hospital's sentience thrived on trespassers' fear, warping their perception until reality itself became unreliable. With trembling hands, he attempted to record everything, hoping documentation could serve as proof, or at least a lifeline. Shadows flickered around him, some forming grotesque humanoid shapes, others blending seamlessly with the darkness. The whispers now directly addressed him. "You cannot leave. You belong." His escape became a frenzied navigation through corridors that bent, staircases that twisted impossibly, and rooms that appeared and disappeared at will. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of other figures, lost explorers, or perhaps manifestations of the hospital itself, staring from corners with blank, accusatory eyes. Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, yet adrenaline pushed him forward. Every step was a struggle, each breath filled with icy dread, and the weight of unseen eyes pressed constantly on his mind. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Lucas stumbled through a side exit into the overgrown courtyard. The night air hit his face, and the oppressive weight of the hospital lifted slightly, though not entirely. The building remained ominously silent, yet he felt it watching, waiting, calculating for the next intruder. Trembling, he ran across the weeds and cracked pavement. Camera clutched to his chest, ears straining for the faintest sound. Behind him, the windows of Crestwood Hospital reflected the moonlight, unblinking, unyielding, like eyes that had seen countless trespassers and would see countless more. The experience did not end once he left. That night, and in the weeks following, Lucas experienced nightmares of the hospital. Shadows stretching across his bedroom, whispers echoing in empty rooms, and fleeting glimpses of pale, emaciated figures. The hospital had marked him, leaving an invisible tether between himself and the building. Every creak in his apartment sounded like the floorboards of the asylum. Every flicker of light felt like the glow of the surgical wing. Crestwood Hospital had claimed more than his fear. It had taken a piece of his reality. A permanent reminder that curiosity in places marked by suffering can carry consequences far beyond imagination. Let's move to our seventh story. It was a bitter winter evening when Alina, a local urban explorer with a growing online following, decided to investigate the notorious Holleridge factory, an abandoned textile mill that had been shuttered for nearly 50 years. The factory had a dark reputation. Workers had reported accidents and unexplained illnesses long before it was closed, and stories circulated about the building being cursed after a mysterious fire had claimed the lives of several employees. Decades ago, Alina, armed with a camera and flashlight, had spent weeks researching the location, poring over old blueprints, and reading first-hand accounts of the strange occurrences there. She was determined to capture evidence of the paranormal activity that locals feared, and the chill of the winter air did little to deter her excitement. Upon arriving, she noted how the building's exterior had become a decaying monument to industry and neglect. Rusted machinery was visible through shattered windows, bricks crumbling along the corners of the building, and the faint smell of smoke lingered, as though the fire that had destroyed part of the mill had never fully left. Elena stepped cautiously through the broken front doors, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Every sound, the scuttling of rats, the groan of rusted metal, the faint drip of water from broken pipe, echoed unnaturally, heightening her sense of isolation. The air was thick, carrying with it a palpable tension, almost as if the building itself were aware of her intrusion. Inside, the factory floors were covered in a thick layer of dust and debris, remnants of a life once vibrant with industry. Conveyor belts stood motionless, rusted and twisted, and shattered windows allowed the winter wind to howl through the building, carrying with it an eerie, almost whisper-like sound. Alina carefully made her way through the main production hall, noticing that the machinery cast long, jagged shadows across the walls, shapes that seemed to flicker and twist when she looked away. A sudden clatter echoed from above, startling her. She froze, straining to listen, but the sound didn't repeat. It was as if the building itself had decided to acknowledge her presence. As she explored further, Alina discovered the remnants of the workers' break room. Tables were overturned, rusted cups scattered, and the walls were marked with messages scratched into the paint. Some names, dates, and odd symbols she didn't recognize. One message stood out: they watch. Remember. A chill ran down her spine. It felt as though the eyes of the building were upon her, observing, cataloging her every move. Her flashlight flickered, and in the brief darkness, she thought she saw figures standing at the edges of her vision. When the light returned, nothing was there, but the sensation persisted. Elena continued to the second floor, where the air grew colder, more oppressive. The stairs creaked under her weight, each step sounding far too loud in the silence. The layout of the factory seemed off. Hallways that should have led to one room twisted inexplicably, and doors she had passed before now opened into entirely new spaces. Shadows danced along the walls with a life of their own, and faint whispers echoed, too soft to decipher, but unmistakable in intent. Panic began to creep into her mind, but she pressed forward, hoping that documenting everything would provide proof of the supernatural presence she sensed. In one particularly large room, remnants of the textile machinery stood frozen in time. Spools of thread, now gray and brittle, lined the floor, and belts hung limply from rusted gears. Elena noticed a pattern in the dust on the floor, as though someone or something had walked repeatedly in circles. Her flashlight flickered again, and she caught a glimpse of a pale figure standing near the far wall. It was motionless, its features obscured by shadows, yet she felt its gaze pierce through her. She raised her camera, but the figure vanished when she tried to focus, leaving only a faint afterimage on the screen. The air grew heavier, colder, as if the room itself had become aware of her intent to record. Moving cautiously, Elena discovered the remnants of the factory's office. Old ledgers and payroll books were scattered across the floor, pages yellowed and brittle. As she flipped through one, she noticed entries that didn't make sense, names repeated multiple times, dates overlapping impossibly, and notes about night shifts that never existed. A chill wind blew through the broken window, extinguishing her flashlight for a brief moment. In the darkness, she heard a low guttural whisper, "You shouldn't be here." Her hands shook as she relit the flashlight, scanning the room, but it appeared empty. The whisper lingered in her mind, pressing against her thoughts, making it impossible to distinguish reality from the building's influence. The deeper she went into the factory, the more distorted reality became. Machinery that should have been cold and lifeless groaned and creaked, as if it had been activated by invisible hands. Shadows stretched unnaturally across walls, forming shapes that looked vaguely human but moved in ways that defied natural anatomy. Elena began to feel a presence following her, an intangible weight at the back of her mind, accompanied by the sensation of eyes on her neck. Every time she turned, nothing was there, yet the feeling never left. Her heartbeat accelerated, but curiosity and the need for proof kept her moving forward. She reached a room that had been destroyed by the fire years ago. Charred beams hung precariously from the ceiling, ash littered the floor, and the air was thick with smoke that seemed almost alive, curling and twisting as if reacting to her presence. In the corner, she noticed a shadow that didn't align with any object in the room, a figure that seemed to shimmer, half present, half phantom. The whispers became intelligible, overlapping in a chorus. "They are here. They never left. You belong." Elena felt her body go cold, a shiver running through her spine as the words reverberated in her mind. Her sense of time began to distort. Minutes felt like hours, and she lost track of how long she had been inside the building. The factory seemed to stretch endlessly, hallways looping back on themselves, staircases appearing where none should exist. Shadows emerged from corners, moving independently of any light source, sometimes appearing behind her, sometimes ahead, always just out of reach. The building had transformed into a living entity, feeding on her fear and disorientation, bending reality to trap her. Elena's camera captured fleeting glimpses of these phenomena, figures that appeared and vanished, shadows that defied physics, and mist that moved with intent. Every attempt to escape seemed futile. Doors led back into the same rooms, hallways twisted impossibly, and the oppressive presence of the factory intensified. She realized that the Holleridge factory did not merely host paranormal activity, orchestrated it, manipulating perception to trap intruders in an endless cycle of fear. Hours later, she stumbled into the remnants of the factory's loading dock. The night outside was dark and still, yet the factory's influence clung to her. Figures seemed to hover in the periphery, whispering indistinct threats. Her hands shook as she tried to navigate the debris-strewn floor, each step sending splinters and dust into the air. The oppressive cold and weight of unseen eyes made it nearly impossible to think clearly. She understood then that the building did not simply want trespassers to leave it, wanted them to be absorbed into its malevolent consciousness, to become part of the factory's long history of torment. Finally, with trembling limbs and a pounding heart, Alina emerged through a broken side exit into the snowy night. The crisp air of the outdoors was a shock to her senses, and for a moment, relief washed over her. But even as she fled into the darkness, she could feel the Holleridge factory's gaze following her. The shadows, whispers, and cold presence lingered in her mind, a tether connecting her to the cursed building. Even weeks later, she would awaken to the sensation of hands brushing her skin, hear indistinct whispers in her apartment, and see fleeting shadows at the edges of her vision. The factory had claimed more than her time, it had claimed a piece of her reality. A permanent reminder that curiosity in places tainted by tragedy can carry consequences beyond comprehension. Let's move to our 8th story. It was the kind of night where the wind seemed to whisper secrets through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Marcus, a seasoned urban explorer, had long heard rumors of the abandoned Ashwood Asylum, a sprawling mental institution, shut down in the 1970s, after a series of unexplained deaths and reports of cruel experiments conducted on patients. Intrigued by the dark history and drawn to the thrill of uncovering hidden horrors, Marcus convinced 2 friends, Lena and Josh, to accompany him. They approached the asylum at twilight, the sun dipping behind jagged silhouettes of broken walls and rusted fences. A sense of unease settled over them, the kind that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. Yet curiosity propelled them forward. Crossing the crumbling perimeter fence, Marcus observed the asylum's towering structure. Its windows were shattered, black voids reflecting the faint light of the moon, and the main entrance sagged on rusted hinges. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, carrying the metallic temps of rust and the faintest trace of something more sinister. The floor beneath them groaned with each step, echoing unnaturally through the cavernous halls. Shadows seemed to slither along the walls, forming shapes that flickered at the edges of vision. Even the faintest sound, a dripping pipe or a gust of wind, sounded amplified, reverberating as if the building itself were aware of their presence. They first entered what had once been the patient's common area. Broken furniture lay strewn across the floor, rusted wheelchairs tipped over, and yellowed papers littered the space. On the walls, faded messages and scratches were etched, remnants of lives forgotten. Marcus felt a chill as he noticed that some of the marks seemed newer, almost freshly scratched into the paint. Lena shivered, claiming she felt eyes on her, though no one else was present. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on their minds, making even the smallest shadows feel threatening as they moved deeper. Marcus led them to the administrative wing, where the records had been left behind in chaos. Files lay scattered across desks, some burned, some water-stained. Among the papers, they found patient charts, detailing experiments that blurred the line between medical treatment and cruel torture. Marcus's stomach churned as he read entries describing treatments that caused severe psychological and physical distress. He realized that the asylum had been more than neglected, it had been a ground for unimaginable suffering, and the echoes of that pain seemed to linger in the very air. A sudden clatter echoed from a nearby hallway, causing Josh to drop his flashlight. In the brief darkness, Marcus thought he saw a figure dart across the room, only to vanish the instant light returned. A whisper followed, so faint it could have been imagined, yet unmistakable. "You shouldn't be here," Lena gasped, clutching Marcus's arm, insisting they leave. But the building seemed to respond, its halls twisting and elongating, creating spaces that weren't there moments before. Doors opened to rooms they didn't remember, and staircases appeared where none should exist. It was as if the asylum itself had become a living trap, feeding on their fear and curiosity. They ascended to the 2nd floor, where patient rooms had been reduced to decayed shells of their former selves. Mattresses were rotted, blankets shredded, and the faint outlines of names scrawled in the dust were visible on bedside tables. Marcus noticed that some rooms had inexplicable scorch marks, as if fire had licked the walls without consuming them. The shadows in these halls seemed to twist and move independently, forming grotesque humanoid shapes. Whispers grew louder, overlapping in a dissonant chorus, each voice seeming to echo personal fears back to them. Marcus felt his mind fray as the voices whispered secrets and threats, pushing at the edges of his sanity. In one room, Lena screamed. Marcus turned to see a figure, a gaunt, pale humanoid with hollow eyes emerging from the far corner. Its limbs were contorted, moving with jerky, unnatural motions. The figure stopped as they locked eyes, and Marcus felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. He raised his flashlight, but the figure vanished, leaving only an afterimage burned into the air. The asylum seemed to pulse with malevolence, reacting to their fear, intensifying the shadows, the whispers, and the sense of inescapable doom. The trio pressed forward, drawn by a combination of terror and compulsion. They reached the old therapy rooms, where rusted equipment and broken chairs lay scattered. On the walls, faded murals depicted distorted figures and twisted faces, their eyes following them as they moved. A sudden gust of wind blew through the broken windows, carrying with it the faint scent of antiseptic mixed with something foul, an olfactory reminder of the asylum's dark past. Marcus realized that the building was not simply haunted. It was sentient, manipulating perception, warping reality, and feeding off their psychological terror. Time lost meaning as they explored further. Hallways seemed to stretch infinitely. Staircases looped back on themselves, and doors led to rooms they had already passed or ones that should not have existed. Shadows moved just beyond the flashlight's reach, figures appearing in peripheral vision, disappearing when observed directly. The whispers became coherent, forming phrases that clawed at their minds. Stay, join us, never leave. Marcus felt his body grow heavy, his limbs sluggish, as though the asylum itself was exerting a physical pull, attempting to trap them forever within its decaying walls. In the old morgue, the air grew colder, frost forming along the edges of rusted drawers. Pale figures emerged from the shadows, their movements fluid yet impossible, limbs bending at unnatural angles. Marcus could hear faint cries, whispers of those who had been lost within the asylum decades ago. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness thickening, and every step forward was a struggle against an unseen force. The asylum had become more than a location, it was a predator, and they were its prey. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Marcus and his friends stumbled upon an emergency exit, partially blocked by debris. The cold night air was a shock to their senses, but even as they escaped the building, they felt its presence lingering. Shadows flickered in the periphery, and faint whispers followed them into the darkness. Weeks later, Marcus would find that the asylum had not released them entirely. The shadows haunted his dreams. The whispers echoed in his apartment, and the sense of being watched never left. Ashwood Asylum had claimed a piece of their minds, a permanent tether to the horrors within. Even after escaping into the night, Marcus, Lena, and Josh couldn't shake the feeling that Ashwood Asylum had not fully released them. Shadows seemed to cling to their peripheral vision, stretching and twisting in ways that defied logic. At home, the faint whispers returned at odd hours, soft, unintelligible at first, then gradually forming words that chilled them to the bone. You belong here, come back. Marcus noticed dust-like motes in the air that seemed to shimmer unnaturally, forming fleeting humanoid shapes that vanished when he tried to focus. Lena would wake screaming, claiming that figures were pressing against her bedroom walls, while Josh confessed that he had begun hearing footsteps echoing behind him even in empty rooms. It became clear that Ashwood Asylum had imprinted itself on their minds, a lingering presence tethering them to the building. Their dreams were no longer safe. They found themselves wandering endless corridors, facing grotesque figures, and hearing the cries of long-dead patients. Even in waking life, small objects would shift inexplicably, chairs slightly turned, doors ajar when they had been closed, reminders that the asylum's influence extended beyond its physical walls. Every attempt to ignore or rationalize the experiences failed, and a creeping paranoia settled over them, the knowledge that some part of the asylum remained inside them, watching, whispering, waiting. The trio realized that their curiosity had carried consequences far beyond the night of exploration. Ashwood Asylum had claimed more than their presence, it had embedded fear into their very perception, ensuring that even in safety, the horrors of that place would continue to haunt them, shaping their reality and minds forever. Let's move to our 9th story. It was just past midnight when Derek, an avid urban explorer with a fascination for the abandoned, decided to investigate the old Thornfield Hospital, a decrepit psychiatric facility long forgotten by the outside world. Rumors surrounded the hospital. Patients had vanished without explanation, staff whispered about unnatural occurrences, and local legends claimed that the building itself had a will of its own, feeding on fear. Derek was drawn not only by curiosity but by a sense of personal challenge. He had explored countless abandoned sites, yet Thornfield carried an ominous reputation that intrigued him more than any other location. Equipped with a flashlight, camera, and a small backpack of supplies, he slipped past the rusted gates, the cold wind cutting through his jacket as if warning him to turn back. The exterior of Thornfield Hospital was a testament to decades of neglect. Windows were shattered or boarded up, the paint peeled from the walls in long curling strips, and vines clawed at the brickwork like skeletal fingers. The main entrance sagged on rusted hinges, groaning as Derek pushed it open. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mold and decay, and every footstep echoed ominously through the vast, empty halls. Dust motes floated in the flashlight beam, and a faint, almost imperceptible whisper seemed to ride the currents of stale air. Derek paused, telling himself it was only the wind, but the unease that gripped him suggested otherwise. The lobby, once a place of reception and order, was now a chaotic ruin. Broken chairs lay scattered across the floor. Glass from shattered windows littered the hall, and the walls were streaked with dirt and water damage. Derek noticed the faint traces of old notices, faded beyond legibility, and scrawled words that seemed unnervingly recent. "Don't look back." A shiver ran down his spine. He told himself it was graffiti, yet the handwriting seemed personal, almost targeted. Ignoring the dread that gnawed at him, he pressed forward, drawn toward the stairwell leading to the upper floors. As he ascended the stairs, each creak seemed unnaturally loud, reverberating through the empty hospital. The second floor was a labyrinth of patient rooms, therapy chambers, and administrative offices. Broken furniture, rotted bedding, and scattered documents painted a vivid picture of abandonment. Yet the shadows in the hallways moved in ways that defied explanation. Derek swore he saw figures at the edge of his flashlight beam, shapes that vanished when he tried to focus on them, leaving only a faint, lingering afterimage. The air grew colder, and his breath formed misty clouds in front of him, though the temperature had not dropped drastically. Something about the building was actively resisting his intrusion. Derek's exploration led him to the old patient wards, where the decay was most pronounced. Beds were twisted, sheets shredded, and the floor was slick with mold. The walls were covered in scratches, some forming cryptic symbols, others resembling names and dates. As he stepped into one particular room, he noticed an unsettling pattern. The scratches appeared to form the outline of a human figure, as though someone, or something, had been pressed against the wall repeatedly. A faint whisper echoed behind him, "You shouldn't be here." His heart leapt, and he spun around, but the hallway remained empty. Only the darkness stared back at him. Pressing further, Derek entered what had once been the therapy rooms. Rusted chairs were tipped over, torn papers littered the floor, and faded murals depicted distorted, grotesque faces that seemed to watch him as he moved. A sudden clatter of metal echoed from down the hall, and Derek froze. The sound came again, closer this time, yet no one was visible. His flashlight flickered, and in the brief moment of darkness, he thought he saw a pale figure standing in the corner, its face obscured, limbs twisted unnaturally. When the light returned, nothing remained, but the sense of being observed persisted, gnawing at his mind. The deeper he ventured into Thornfield, the more reality seemed to warp around him. Hallways looped inexplicably, staircases appeared where none should exist, and doors that had led one way now opened to entirely different rooms. Derek felt the hospital's presence pressing in on him, a malevolent awareness that seemed to manipulate space and time itself. Shadows twisted along the walls independently of any light source, forming humanoid shapes that moved with unnatural jerks and pauses, often appearing in the corner of his vision before vanishing. The building was alive in a way that defied reason, a predator feeding on his fear and disorientation. In one of the larger wards, Derek found evidence of past experiments, medical equipment, rusted but recognizable, patient records scattered, and water damaged, and stains on the floor that suggested violence. The air here was thick, almost viscous, as though each breath carried the weight of decades of suffering. Derek's camera flickered as he tried to capture images, the lens catching fleeting shadows and forms that disappeared the instant he looked directly at them. Whispers grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony of voices, each one dripping with malice. "Stay. Join us. Never leave." He felt his mind strain under the psychological pressure, yet a compulsion, half curiosity, half terror pushed him onward. Hours seemed to pass, yet time felt fractured. Derek wandered through endless corridors, encountering doors that led to identical rooms, stairwells that looped back on themselves, and shadows that mirrored his every move with a grotesque delay. The hospital seemed intent on breaking him, feeding on fear and confusion, blurring the line between reality and hallucination. Pale figures flickered in the corners of his vision, appearing just long enough to unnerve him before vanishing. Faint cries and incoherent whispers echoed through the halls, reminding him that the building held the echoes of all who had suffered within its walls. Eventually, he reached the hospital's chapel, a space once intended for solace, but now defiled by decay and darkness. Broken pews lay scattered, the altar was overturned, and symbols scratched into the floor gave the impression of rituals performed long ago. Shadows moved independently of the crumbling architecture, forming shapes that seemed vaguely human but twisted in impossible ways. Derek felt an overwhelming sense of dread, the realization dawning that Thornfield Hospital did not merely house echoes of the past, it actively fed on the living, warping their perception and luring them into psychological traps from which few returned unchanged. Finally, after navigating what felt like an eternity of twisting corridors, Derek found a broken emergency exit leading to the freezing night outside. Relief washed over him as he stumbled into the cold air, but even then, the hospital's influence lingered. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edges of his vision, whispers echoed faintly in his ears, and a lingering sense of being watched pressed upon him. Weeks later, he would find that the hospital had not released him entirely. Nightmares plagued his sleep, faint shapes moved in the corners of his apartment, and an ever-present sense of dread reminded him that Thornfield Hospital had claimed a part of his mind. Curiosity had tethered him to the building, and its grip would never fully loosen. Even after leaving Thornfield Hospital, Derek could feel its grip lingering. The shadows seemed to follow him home, stretching and shifting in ways that defied reality. At night, faint whispers crept into his bedroom, soft at first, then growing clearer, repeating the same chilling phrases. "You're not done. Come back." Objects in his apartment subtly moved, chairs slightly askew, doors ajar when he had left them closed, and the sense of being watched never disappeared. Derek began seeing fleeting images in mirrors and windows, pale figures standing silently, vanishing the moment he blinked. Sleep became a battleground. In his dreams, the hospital corridors stretched endlessly, looping back on themselves, walls pulsating as though alive. Figures emerged from shadows, their faces twisted with torment, whispering secrets and threats that made his skin crawl. Even waking moments were tainted. The line between hallucination and reality blurred, leaving him unsure if the whispers came from Thornfield or from his own unraveling mind. Each day, the pull of the hospital felt stronger, a reminder that his trespassing had bound him to Thornfield in a way that could never be undone. Let's move to our 10th story. It was a bitterly cold evening when Emily and her friend Marcus decided to explore the abandoned Hawthorne Mill, a defunct textile factory long rumored to be haunted. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the factory workers had disappeared during the late 1940s under mysterious circumstances. Machinery had been known to operate by itself, and eerie screams were occasionally heard echoing across the surrounding forest. Both thrill seekers and amateur urban explorers, Emily and Marcus were drawn to the mystery, eager to uncover the truth for themselves. As they approached the rusted gates, the wind seemed to carry faint, almost human whispers, brushing against their ears, like icy fingers warning them to turn back. The mill itself was a hulking structure of decaying red brick and broken windows. The main entrance sagged on its hinges, revealing darkness within. Inside, the air was heavy with the metallic scent of rust, mold, and something else Emily couldn't quite identify, a subtle, cloying presence that made her skin crawl. Each step on the creaking wooden floors echoed ominously, sending vibrations through the walls that seemed to respond in kind. Shadows stretched unnaturally, dancing at the edges of their flashlight beams, making it difficult to distinguish reality from imagination. Yet curiosity pressed them onward. The main floor was a chaotic tableau of decay. Rusted looms and shattered conveyor belts lay strewn across the area, and piles of dusty fabric littered the ground. Emily noticed what appeared to be handprints in the thick layer of dust covering the floor, smudged as if someone or something had recently passed. Marcus, taking photographs, caught fleeting glimpses of movement in the corner of his lens, figures that disappeared when he turned his head. A faint whisper, almost like someone calling his name, made him freeze in place. The factory seemed alive, an oppressive, sentient entity feeding on their attention and fear. They ascended a narrow stairwell leading to the second floor, the air growing colder with each step. The upper corridors were narrower, lined with small rooms that had once housed workers and storage. Dust-covered machinery was scattered about, some still partially functional, their gears silently threatening to spring to life. In one room, Emily noticed a chair, overturned on its side, despite no apparent cause. Shadows pooled in the corners, forming shapes that were vaguely humanoid, but grotesquely twisted. The feeling of being watched intensified with every step, and a low hum, almost imperceptible, seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. As they explored further, they entered the former break room. The walls were covered in peeling paint and faded notices, some of which contained cryptic warnings. "Do not stay after dark. The machines remember." Emily shivered, realizing that the factory held memories of both suffering and death preserved in the very structure of the building. Rusted cups and broken tables littered the floor, and a faint stain on the wall resembled a handprint, though Emily wasn't sure if it was real or a trick of her mind. The air felt charged, thick with a presence that seemed to grow stronger as they lingered. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed from the far end of the hall. Both Emily and Marcus froze, flashlights sweeping the room, but no one was there. The noise repeated, louder this time, followed by a faint whisper. "You shouldn't be here." Marcus's hand trembled as he pointed the beam toward the noise, catching a fleeting glimpse of a pale figure standing in the shadows before it vanished. Emily gasped, feeling a cold draft brush past her, carrying a scent of something metallic, like blood. The factory wasn't merely abandoned, it was aware of their intrusion, and it seemed intent on making them pay for it. They continued exploring, drawn to the source of the disturbance. Hallways twisted unexpectedly, staircases appeared in places they didn't remember, and rooms seemed to loop back on themselves. Emily began feeling dizzy, disoriented, as the boundaries of reality stretched thin. Shadows stretched and shifted independently, forming humanoid shapes that watched their every move. Occasionally, Marcus would hear faint, incoherent whispers, echoing from empty corners, urging them deeper into the factory. It became clear that Hawthorne Mill had a malevolent will, warping both space and perception, feeding on their fear. In the main machinery hall, the largest and most foreboding room, Emily and Marcus encountered the remnants of the factory's production line. Rusted looms and belts twisted across the floor, like skeletal remains. A strange, almost rhythmic hum filled the room, vibrating through the floorboards and up their legs. Shadows danced along the walls, elongating and contorting in impossible ways. Then, a figure emerged, tall, gaunt, humanoid, with hollow eyes and twisted limbs. It didn't move in a natural manner. Its jerky, unnatural gait made Emily's stomach churn. The figure seemed aware of them, a predator assessing its prey. Emily instinctively stepped back, and the figure vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only an afterimage that burned into her vision. The air grew colder, and the hum intensified, as if the building itself were drawing energy from their terror. Emily felt her pulse racing, every instinct screaming to flee. Yet an inexplicable compulsion forced them deeper into the heart of the factory. They reached a room at the far end of the hall, where the faint light of the moon filtered through broken windows. Here, the walls were covered in cryptic symbols, some smeared with a dark substance that Emily dared not identify. The whispers now formed words, chillingly clear. "Stay. Become part of us." Fear tightened its grip on them, but they pressed on, navigating corridors that seemed endless. Every room held new horror shadows that didn't belong, figures that flickered at the edges of their vision, and the faint sensation of unseen hands brushing against their skin. Emily's flashlight flickered repeatedly, casting fleeting glimpses of grotesque shapes across the walls. Marcus tried to photograph the phenomenon, but his camera refused to focus, capturing only static-filled images that hinted at movements just beyond perception. The factory's malevolence was tangible, pressing in on them from all directions. Hours passed, though time felt warped. Emily and Marcus began to notice that some doors led back to places they had already explored, hallways looped impossibly, and shadows followed them in a delayed, mocking mimicry. Their minds strained under the pressure, the thin veil between reality and hallucination tearing with every step. Pale figures emerged briefly from darkness, their faces twisted in anguish, mouths opening to release silent screams. The hum of the machinery rose to a near-deafening pitch, vibrating through their bones and resonating with the terror that had built in the room over decades. Finally, in what appeared to be a storage room near the factory's rear exit, Emily stumbled across an old ledger, its pages yellowed and brittle. The entries detailed accidents, disappearances, and strange occurrences spanning years, some dating back to the 1930s. Names of workers who had vanished without explanation were meticulously recorded, along with cryptic notes hinting at the factory's awareness, its sentience, and the inexplicable phenomena surrounding it. Emily realized that Hawthorne Mill had claimed more than lives it, had absorbed fear, pain, and terror into its very structure, a living archive of suffering. The exit lay just beyond the storage room, a shattered door leading to the frigid night outside. Relief washed over them as they stumbled into the cold air, yet even in the moonlight, the factory's presence lingered. Shadows flickered at the edges of vision, whispers murmured faintly through the wind, and a lingering sensation of being observed pressed down upon them. Weeks later, Emily and Marcus would find that the factory's influence had followed them home. Dreams were haunted by looping corridors, fleeting glimpses of pale figures, and the constant hum of unseen machinery. Even in waking life, subtle phenomena shifted chair, an ajar door, or a fleeting shadow reminded them that Hawthorne Mill had claimed a part of their minds, and the connection would never fully release them. Even after escaping the factory, Emily and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Hawthorne Mill had marked them. Shadows seemed to linger just beyond their vision, twisting unnaturally, and the faint hum of machinery echoed in their ears, even in complete silence. At night, dreams pulled them back to the factory's endless corridors, where figures with hollow eyes and twisted limbs stalked them relentlessly. Objects in their homes subtly shifted, cups tipped over, doors slightly ajar, and faint scratches appeared on walls where nothing had touched them. Gradually, the sense of being watched grew oppressive. Whispers became louder in the dead of night, calling their names, repeating cryptic warnings, urging them to return. Even when awake, fleeting images of pale figures appeared in mirrors or out of the corner of their eyes, vanishing when they tried to focus. Each attempt to rationalize these experiences failed, leaving only the terrifying knowledge that Hawthorne Mill had embedded itself into their perception. It had not merely been a place of trespassing, it had become a permanent, malevolent presence in their lives, a lingering horror that would never let them go. Let's move to our 11th story. It was a quiet, overcast evening when Jenna, a thrill-seeker fascinated by abandoned places, decided to explore the old Whitmore Asylum, a crumbling psychiatric institution notorious for its dark history. The asylum had been shuttered for decades, yet stories persisted of patients disappearing without a trace, eerie screams echoing through the night, and staff who claimed the building itself was alive with an unseen presence. Jenna, carrying only a flashlight and her camera, slipped through a broken side gate, the rusted metal scraping softly as she pushed it aside. The moment she stepped inside, the air felt heavy, dense with a silence so profound it pressed against her ears, and an inexplicable chill ran down her spine. The asylum's lobby was a decayed shell of what it once was, with dust-covered furniture and peeling paint that revealed decades of neglect. Rusted filing cabinets lined the walls, some doors hanging open to reveal scattered patient records, yellowed and water-damaged. Faint traces of handwriting were still legible, dates and notes that hinted at experiments gone wrong, treatments that were more punishment than therapy. Jenna shivered as she realized the building wasn't simply abandoned. It was saturated with the pain, fear, and suffering of everyone who had been trapped within its walls. The shadows in the corners seemed to move independently of her flashlight, stretching and writhing like living entities. Jenna moved cautiously into the hallways that led to the patient wards. Each step on the cracked tile floor echoed ominously, a distorted echo that seemed to respond to her movements. The walls were streaked with dirt and faded graffiti, some of it recent, warning her to leave, while other marks were older, scratched deeply into the plaster, almost like desperate cries, frozen in time. Occasionally a door would creak open by itself, the hinges grown sharp and sudden, sending her heart racing. A faint whisper sometimes followed her, the words indistinct but chillingly urgent, as if someone or something was trying to communicate through the years. The patient rooms were a chaotic testament to years of abandonment. Rusted bed frames, torn mattresses, and decayed personal belongings were scattered across the floors. Some walls bore strange symbols, scrawled in dark substances that had dried and cracked over time. In one room, Jenna noticed the faint outline of a hand pressed into the wall, the impression deep enough to suggest it was made by force. The air was thick with a metallic scent, and every inhale carried the faint trace of something far older, something unnatural. Her flashlight flickered, and in the brief darkness, she thought she saw figures huddled in the corners, their faces pale and eyes hollow. As she ventured further, Jenna discovered what had once been the therapy rooms. The furniture was broken, chairs overturned, tables splintered. Yet the most disturbing element was the eerie sense of movement in the shadows. Figures appeared just beyond her vision, vanishing when she turned her head, leaving only a lingering, oppressive presence. The faint sound of murmuring filled the air, a chorus of voices that seemed both distant and immediately next to her, speaking in fragmented sentences, half-remembered names, and urgent warnings. Her pulse quickened, but the compulsion to explore further was stronger than fear. Something within the building was calling her deeper, urging her to uncover its secrets. Navigating the narrow stairwells to the upper floors, Jenna felt the atmosphere shift. The air grew colder, and the whispers intensified, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of dread. Doors led to rooms she didn't remember passing before, and hallways twisted in impossible directions. She began to experience fleeting visions of pale figures standing in corners, screaming silently, faces contorted in agony. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward her, every creak of the floor underfoot a signal that the asylum itself was aware of her presence. Jenna realized that Whitmore Asylum was no ordinary building. It had become a vessel for the trauma and terror of countless souls, absorbing and amplifying their suffering over decades. Eventually, Jenna reached the asylum's chapel, a space that had once offered solace, but now felt malevolent. Broken pews lay scattered across the floor, the altar was overturned, and the walls were etched with symbols she could not recognize. Shadows moved independently of her flashlight, forming vaguely human shapes that twitched and jerked unnaturally. A low, guttural hum filled the space, vibrating through the floorboards and into her chest, resonating with the dread that hung in the room. For a fleeting moment, Jenna felt paralyzed, as if the building itself had seized control of her body, compelling her to stay and witness its horrors. Desperate to escape, she retraced her steps through the labyrinthine corridors, but the asylum seemed intent on trapping her. Hallways twisted upon themselves, doors led to unfamiliar rooms, and shadows pursued her in a delayed mimicry of her movements. Pale figures emerged and vanished at the edge of her vision, their silent screams echoing in her mind. The whispers became urgent, intelligible, calling her name and warning her of consequences should she leave. Jenna's camera captured fleeting, impossible forms, twisted shapes that flickered between solid and spectral, sometimes resembling patients, sometimes something far more grotesque. Hours passed, or perhaps mere minutes. Time was meaningless within the asylum. Jenna's mind teetered on the brink of panic, the relentless presence of unseen entities pressing against her thoughts. She finally stumbled upon the records room, where ledgers and patient files lay in disarray. Names, dates, and cryptic annotations filled the pages, some describing disappearances, others hinting at supernatural phenomena tied to the asylum's architecture. Jenna understood that Whitmore Asylum had a consciousness, an ancient malice born from decades of suffering, and it had claimed a part of her merely by trespassing. Her final escape came through a small, barely noticeable door at the rear of the asylum. The outside world felt unreal, bathed in the dim gray light of pre-dawn. Relief washed over her, but even as she walked away, the oppressive weight of the building lingered. Shadows seemed to stretch beyond the asylum walls. Whispers followed her in the wind, and in mirrors at home, she sometimes glimpsed the pale faces of the lost. Whitmore Asylum had not only been a place of horror, it had become a permanent scar upon her mind, a reminder that some trespasses never truly end. Even after leaving Whitmore Asylum behind, Jenna could feel its presence clinging to her. Shadows seemed to linger just at the edge of her vision, stretching and twisting in impossible ways. And the faint echoes of whispers sometimes slipped into her thoughts, repeating fragments of names and warnings. At night, her dreams dragged her back to the asylum's endless corridors, where pale figures with hollow eyes and contorted faces reached for her, vanishing whenever she tried to look directly at them. Objects in her apartment shifted subtly, doors left ajar, chairs slightly moved, and faint scratches appeared on walls as if guiding her back toward the asylum. Gradually, Jenna began to notice that even her reflection didn't feel entirely her own. Shadows flitted across mirrors, occasionally forming the outlines of figures she hadn't seen before, while whispers seemed to follow her in the quietest moments, urging her to return. The feeling of being observed never fully disappeared. No matter how far she moved from the asylum, Whitmore Asylum had not just been a place she trespassed, had imprinted itself on her mind, embedding a lingering malevolent presence that would haunt her for the rest of her life.